Okay, hello everybody. So today is Thursday the 25th. Mercury has just stationed direct in Aries, and Mars is applying to conjunction with Neptune in Pisces. And we also just recently had a full moon in Scorpio. At the point of recording this video, the moon's still in Scorpio in an opposition to Jupiter and Uranus. And I have basically been taking this approach in my channel, um, not to do the lunations, and just to focus more on these planetary aspects. And this is not that I don't believe in the lunations or anything like that, but basically taking a kind of a different approach rather than doing the like if I did rather than doing the most popular videos, taking a kind of like different approach and kind of getting into the more of the nitty gritty with the aspects and stuff like that. Although I have to say that it was a fairly intense full moon, and I was, the whole thing about Jupiter and Uranus was that I was, a lot of people have been talking about the sort of like rebellious or revolutionary or something, that kind of energy, but I have to admit that, I have, maybe it's my own perspective or my own relation to it. Um, but I'll just sort of describe, like, I don't know. I mean, for one thing, I said, I kind of made this joke because like the Jupiter Uranus conjunction was happening on 420, and I said that like 420 was going to be lit because of the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, and then I didn't go out and do anything for 420. I didn't even smoke weed or anything like that. I stayed at home and was sober, and then I looked at the news, and basically it was like a bunch of people tried to have some sort of like protest and got in trouble with the cops because here in Canada we've legalized marijuana, and this kind of thing is that like it's legal, but there's all these people protesting that are upset with how it's regulated, or like these, there's a certain, I'm not going to get into that, but like it didn't really seem like maybe there was a bit of rebellion, but it didn't really seem like, I know we're not going to get into that one too much. The thing is, like, I also have to admit that I've personally just been going through this thing where like to do it's kind of complicated because there's this kind of sort of question about politics, and I sort of had this resolution to be more apolitical or not get so much into politics on my astrology channel. Um, but that's basically part of this reason is because one of the things that I've noticed is that there are there's things that I'm interested in that when that has to relate to, let's say, divination or mysticism or philosophy or stuff like that, that I could very well get into that stuff and have people watching that have completely different political views and completely different takes on it, but yet we come together under this common thing of an interest in these kind of topics, right? And it just kind of strikes me that, like, why, if things become so polarized and divided and stuff like that, that if you have an opportunity for people to come together on a certain issue, why make it so that you're putting them off, or or that if you do want to like try to change people's minds or express a different belief, like, why alienate them by setting yourself up as somebody who is by definition somebody they're not going to listen to, right? But the thing is, I have to admit that, like, in my area, like, there's certain things that I've talked a lot on this channel before about the problem with, like, the high gas prices and, like, the gas prices where I live. I live in BC, which has the most expensive gas in the all of Canada, and the gas just continues to skyrocket. However, like, I've never had a driver's license before. And when I was younger, I spent a couple of years where I lived in Vancouver. I went traveling for a bit after that. But when I was in Vancouver, I mainly hung out with people who were into, like, doing stuff like working as bike couriers and just riding bikes around in town. And, even people with families that would just, like, not have cars and just ride bikes and stuff like that. And I just got into this way of living that was like you could do all sorts of stuff without using a car. And it was like, there's some way of like, based on the current kind of economic crisis we're facing. And keep in mind that was also back in 2008 and 2009 that I was living in the city. That was like, right in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I learned how to try to live frugally or cheaply, or, if the gas is really expensive, how to work around that. And it's sort of like I in some way I feel like really lucky and fortunate in that the way that I've lived my life has given me a view of a way to live where if the gas is really expensive, then you don't feel like your whole world is falling down around you, right? And so I think there's one of the things about the whole political thing is that I just sort of feel a bit at odds, because what I see, like, basically I feel kind of socially alienated, and what I see in the media is a bunch of people who are, basically feel like it's impossible to live without a car, and that like they're basically, but in resistance to this situation where the economic factors are making it more and more difficult to to live that kind of life, right? And people are, they don't, we're not like, we don't have the great public transit that they do in Europe or in other countries or whatever, right? There are, whatever, I'm not going to, the other thing though that I wanted to focus on though, that came up for me around this full moon and with this Mars and Neptune conjunction is that I have to admit that I was getting kind of frustrated just about like feeling like an outsider, or just feeling kind of alienated, and just what I see represented in the, like, if I went on my local the news for my local community, I would see people expressing these opinions that would really kind of set me off. But then I figured, like, there's something with Mars Neptune that feels a little bit like knowing when to, you have to choose your battles kind of thing. And one of the examples of something that is that where I live, there's like a huge housing crisis, right? And I was getting a little bit upset about this because what I was seeing in like the comment sections, or people, there's people actually doing a protest, not because people protesting because they were upset that the housing was so expensive and that it was so inaccessible to find a place to live. These people were protesting because they were going to build high-rise towers in what, used to be considered more of a small town area, right? And there's something about Neptune that I feel has to do with this kind of like sentimentality, or like this sort of like, this kind of romantic notion of like what your community is like, that may be something you're kind of dreaming up, and then maybe Mars kind of disrupts that. And I was just, like, the other thing is that people were also protesting that the government is trying to like address this housing crisis by creating, laws where you can only use your primary residence as an Air BNB. Like, you can't just own a piece of property and make money off of it as an Air BNB. And there's all these people that, like, to me, I'm kind of like, look, if you're in a position where you're complaining about that, that means that you own property that you are profiting off at the expense of there being housing available for people in need. And you're, I don't have much sympathy for that. I'm sorry, right? But, like, just feeling basically, sort of feeling like you're in a really bourgeois neighborhood where there's all these like middle class people who are just passive property owners who are upset that they can't make money off their Airbnbs, or are upset that they were going to get more urban density, like these towers of apartments that may actually do something about the housing. But the thing is, this is basically like, like, should I like make a video? I mean, I guess I'm making a video now and expressing myself, but I was basically kind of thought, I better just like, maybe better just keep quiet, because these people are basically like, there's a huge engine of supply and demand and trying to meet the needs of the many and all this kind of stuff, and a loud minority that's just resisting it. And what ended up happening was that they had a hearing, and they had the people there voice their complaints, and the city heard the complaints and decided to say, well, we're going to go ahead and build the high-rise towers anyways, right? So there wasn't really any need. Like, I am in support of the high-rise towers getting built. I'm in support of, I don't like this whole Air BNB thing, right? So I'm in support of all this stuff, and there's just like, is there any reason for me to go and engage in the argument with these people? Or I could just, I have to admit, I'm doing it now to at least express myself, right? But there's just something about like the Neptune being like the way the water is flowing, the way the Mars being like this rapid river, and if you're somebody who's like trying to resist that, and you're just gonna get overcome by the forces, like it doesn't do any good for me to get in there and try to contribute my opinion or contribute my voice. You just have to step aside and let the thing go. Let events take the course they're going to take, and it doesn't do me any good to get involved with this, right? But I was thinking that there was something about this dynamic where, there's certain conflicts that are being overcome and certain changes that are taking place, and there's something about also the idea that Mercury stands for planning and negotiating and decision making, and Mercury is stationing direct in Mars, or Aries, the Mars ruled sign. But Mars is coming into this conjunction with Neptune, which people also talk about it as kind of like foggy, or like your options are clouded, or it's a bit of confusion, or you're caught in some sort of sentimental fantasy and not seeing things clearly, right? And I've been like reading this James Hillman book, Kinds of Power, and I got to this chapter in Kinds of Power about decision making that I thought was very maybe appropriate for this kind of situation, as decisions are being made of how to handle this situation that affects lots of different people collectively right now. So I'll just read this from the James Hillman. Okay. On decision. Can't make up his mind. Won't come down on either side. Paralyzed by indecision. These condemnations express all too clearly the importance of decisiveness for the exercise of power. Decision releases power. Perhaps at the very essence of agency, decision is power. A decision by the Supreme Court of the United States supersedes the executive order by the President and a law passed by Congress. It is comfortably believed that decisions result from a full briefing. Once all the angles are considered, all eventualities foreseen, decision follows. It is as if decision were a matter of weighing pros and cons in the balancing scales of judgment. This view of decision-making gives too much credit to reason. Decisions come as much from the gut, from a chance bit of data or gossip, from intuitive hunches, from the still small voice of what I am elsewhere calling the angel, as they come from a long pondering, a well-written digest of the facts. Decision's root, cater, means striking down. The first Latin meaning is hardly rational. It exclaims brute power. To strike, smite, beat. The second meaning ties cater into sexual intercourse, as we witness any day when birds mate. The third meaning is to kill, slay, murder, to attack, slaughter in sacrifice. And a fourth, to crack, smash, break. Cato itself goes back to the Sanskrit kidati, press, or kata, hammer. Now, this is, Mars, Neptune in the third decan of Pisces maybe is less like this than when Mars is going to ingress shortly into Aries, where they have the first decan of Aries Austin Coppock sort of describes it as like the battle axe kind of, this kind of decisive decision making. The hammer comes down, much in the same way that when it comes to this sort of thing about like whether or not to build high-rise apartments and all this kind of stuff, the hammer comes down. There you go. The decision's made. We don't have to deal with that conflict anymore, right? When the gravel strikes to end the market's trading day, conclude an auction, or bring to a close the court's proceedings, there is an echo of sudden, even violent death. No going back. So little wonder our agonizing indecisions, for decision brings death into the scene, and the person who can make a decision, like Kennedy alone before the Bay of Pigs, like Eisenhower alone before D-Day, deciding to give the go-ahead order to despite the uncertain weather. And the uncertain weather kind of feels like the Mars-Neptune thing a little bit, right? In the presence of death, with whom there are no deals, no compromises. No wonder in the more ordinary business life it is difficult to bring about a decisive closing, whether by jury, a legislature, a real estate agent, or a salesman. Decisiveness is necessary to create. The dictionary says the 10th meaning of Cato is to create by cutting. Each of the tiniest actions in the arts requires decisions, to include and to exclude, to move this way or that, to select this first and that later. Every movie we see and book we read is a creation made by cutting. Decision knows when and where to stop, to let the moment of death conclude a work. A painting teacher once told a friend of mine that the thing she finds most important in teaching the art of painting is when to stop the painting, when to cut, close, end. The creativity of decision shows first of all as the capacity to move forward out of irresolution and ambivalence. However, at the same moment that we let loose action by our decision, we also create enemies. Decisions divide. They cut in two. This is also very, the Mars cutting thing, right? To decide, says the Oxford English Dictionary, means to determine by giving the victory to one side or the other. Each decision leaves a loser and builds a shadow feelings in an organization. The defeated party becomes the injured party and seeks to redress of what it feels are the wrongs arising from a wrong decision. Now, I don't know. Like, maybe I should... This is the other thing, is that maybe it would be wiser not to bring up the politics, because there's probably a lot of people who are sore about the decision that was made to build high-rise towers to address the housing issue. And, maybe this is just like rubbing salt in the wound or something. But I don't know. Maybe, whatever. I'm still basically expressing... this is what happened. The decision was made, and I'm not just neutral on this. I have a point of view. And part of this is because it's like the town that where they building these high-rise towers is less than 100 years old. We're talking about, like, we're in British Columbia. We're in a place that is like, white settlers colonizing a land that's been here for ages since we got here. And we have a small little town, and it's like, what? So if you can come here and radically transform a whole country into a different kind of civilization, and yet you have this sort of like idea that there's going to be this like quaint little town that's just going to stay the same forever, and yet this has only been here like a little blip, You like we've barely even been here, and you expect it's just going to stay like this forever? Like, it's kind of like this like fantasy, like the way you've lived your life is like the eternal thing that's never unchanging, and like it has to stay that way because like it's like what I was trying to say in my hauntology video, that like it's shocking that there's going to be, your children are going to need a place to live. It's shocking that there are going to be other generations who are going to have a different story, who are going to go on and do different things. It's not just going to be the same all the time, right? But this is kind of, I don't know. Maybe I'm getting a little bit distracted. I'll go back to reading the Hillman here. Disaffection subverts resistance. Revenge builds in the corridors of power. Since each victory means more unwilling captives of that decision, power built on decisiveness can lead to tyranny. Alexander of Macedon and the generals of the Roman Empire knew that victory creates only more enemies, and so they took as slaves or exterminated the remnants of the defeated, tore apart their cities and temples stone for stone, salted their earth. The demand for unconditional surrender aims to eliminate forever the shadow possibility of revenge that lies latent after decisive victory. Leaders today take comfort in the belief that we've put Greece and Rome behind us. Well, you're watching a Hellenistic astrology channel, and this is part why I'm related to Hillman here, right? We today prefer consensus decisions rather than victories. We believe in compromises that the other side can be brought around or bought off. The deal has replaced victory and defeat, and so decisions are today hammered out more subtly, letting everybody have a piece of the action by buying the right legal language. Therefore, decisions are more likely to be headed off before a decisive crisis comes to a head. That is, the person in charge tries to avoid bringing down the hammer on one side or the other in favor of forging different constituencies into larger unities with vague edges and mush words. And that here you get the Mars-Neptune thing, like where you have the boundaries of the constituency are kind of blurry, and you're using mushy language, being not precise, not distinct in where you really stand, to try to include a kind of amorphous blob that you would call a compromise that gives you a kind of democratic consensus, getting everybody on board the same boat, right? And trying to avoid the conflict, right? And this is something about why I think this works for the Mars-Neptune. This tactic is as ancient as the Empire of China and as contemporary as the White House of Clinton. And this is when this was written in the 90s, so it's a bit old now, right? The heroic sword that cuts issues in two warring camps calls the tactic waffling, wavering, and fence straddling. Nonetheless, these hesitations show a wary awareness of the pitfalls of all decisiveness. It can be its own undoing because the accumulated defeats created by decisiveness itself. The seemingly indecisive tactics of trimming the sails with the wind follows from a prior decision. To avoid decision at all costs, and this trimming and shifting must be distinguished from neurotic indecisiveness. By this I mean holding oneself and others in suspension in order to hold on to power. I can stay in control by indecision just as cleverly as by risking a decision. There is a narcissistic use of indecision that makes one the center of attention, as everyone in the king's court waits and wonders what will be decided. The longer one can hesitate, call in councils for consultations, hold policy roundtables, and read determination papers from committees of experts, the more important seems to be both the decision and one's own position within the decision-making process. So I think that's another Mars, Neptune, and Pisces thing, is that there could be both the decision and also the holding off of decision-making could itself be the stalling of decision-making, could also be a display of power, right? Like holding up the change that is going to be taking place, right? In short, there are at least three varieties of indecision that may look much alike. First, timidity, being reluctant to slice through with the sword because one fears the exposure and the risks consequent upon cutting. Second, prudent wisdom that foresees the aftermath of a decision. Third, neurotic wavering in order to keep one's prestige and stay in office. When hesitating about a decision, it can be useful to examine ruthlessly the intermixing of these three motives. But even self-examination calls for a decision. So there you go. I thought that was very apt for some of the things that I was seeing play out in the community around me at this particular point in time. And the thing is, like I said, it's hard for me to really describe what I'm trying to do by being my will to be apolitical, because on one hand I'm not apolitical. I definitely do have political perspectives and opinions and stuff like that. But I just I feel like there's this like I don't want to completely alienate people from my channel just because I have a certain perspective, and that there's something about like how I think ideally politics needs to be like, it's okay to have, it's better to have a healthy opposition where you can accept that we live in a place where there's a multitude of different perspectives and a multitude of different beliefs, but you want the people who disagree with you to have good points, right? You don't want the people like, the whole thing about the high-rise towers was, I was reading in the news article that the developer was talking to the people who were resisting the decision, and they were saying that, like, they were just thinking that, like, a 23-story tower, where currently the highest buildings might only be like 3 or 4 stories. It's too much of an extreme change for them. And so the guy was like, well, what are you thinking? Like, if 23 stories is too tall, what would be more appropriate? And they're like, well, I don't know, 4 stories, 5 stories. But the thing is, like, these people, the whole point is like they're not gonna budge. They just want things to stay the same. So, like, you could compromise and say, like, was it okay? What if we just build a bunch of 10-story towers? No, that wouldn't be good for them either. The whole point is, like, they just want things to stay the same. They don't want anything to evolve or grow or, like, adapt. And the thing, well, I was just a little bit, if these people are also just making money off of Airbnbs and expensive rentals, like, if these kind of people start to sound like they're just like, are these like landlords who are just profiting off of this situation and they don't want to change just because they are just like profiting off a kind of bottleneck where they have the thing that's really in demand and they don't want there to be more supply because they can make lots of money off of it. I don't know, right? And I'm just expressing this because this is just one of these things that I feel like I just look around at what I see, like, was represented as the community around me. And to me, that, like, these aren't people that I'm really that feel that friendly towards or sympathetic towards. I'm sorry. I don't really feel sympathy for these people. Go build the towers. I'm all for it, right? Now, the other thing about all this, with Neptune and Mars, I thought that this was the Hillman, of course, I mentioned in my other video that Hillman had a Sun and Moon conjunction, a new moon in Aries, very similar to the Aries eclipse we just had. And so Hillman was a very Marsy, yang-y kind of, yang kind of guy. And Neptune and Pisces, however, I feel like if Neptune is one of these outer planets and it doesn't have the same history of associations. Some people say Neptune's the ruler of Pisces. I don't quite go in that direction. But I do think that Neptune has a very yin kind of quality, right? Like, Neptune, there's something about, I often think, like, kind of like yielding to the situation at hand, rather than just trying to smash through. Like, I mean, once Mars gets into Aries, it may be like smashing through with the battle axe or something, but there's a sort of like trying to kind of like yield to the sort of collective situation that we find ourselves in. But I mean, that like I was saying with the Hillman stuff, that could also come out as like stalling a decision, or with a Mercury stationing direct, it's starting to move forward, but Mercury's very slow right now. Mercury's in the slowest part of its phase. Mercury's not necessarily going very fast. So there could be like stalling or trying to avoid, making enemies by being decisive and coming down on one side or the other, right? And then there's also this thing that I've noticed about, I'm just going to throw it in there that there's like a completely different direction that I was thinking about with this. Now, and what I was thinking about, I mean, I'm not going to spend that much time on this one, but the basic idea that I've had in mind for a while, the birth chart of Emily Dickenson, and it's not really, it's interesting to me for a number of reasons. First of all, that, what I'm saying about this whole battle axe of decision making and what's going to happen when Mars moves into Aries. And, you know, like my dad had Mars in Aries, and my dad was a really kind of like athletic guy. Like he would set up a bike, exercise bike in his garage and like watch boxing videos, watching guys fight, and he'd be like pedaling on his bike and getting all like he would do all this kind of exercise stuff, right? He was much more athletic and he was very, very proactive, go-getter kind of guy. He did have some one time he broke his arm and he had to be off for a whole year though from a cycling accident, right? So there's something about Mars and Aries that I feel like is very, you know, like it can be very athletic and very active, but then there's certain injuries and accidents that come up as a result of those activities. And you can be doing like, I'm going to do all this really yongy stuff to be good for my health, but that could also, you know, cause problems even with Mars in its own domicile in dignity, right? And so there's something about, you know, with all this in mind, I think Neptune may have this effect of like, you know, cooling that down a little bit. But there's something, Emily Dickenson I find is interesting because Emily Dickenson had Mars conjunct Pluto in Aries. And when you think about Mars in Aries, Mars and Pluto in Aries, and what if you're just an astrologer and you're trying to think about what that is, I don't think Emily Dickenson is really the first person that comes to your mind, right? Now, I'm bringing this up because Emily Dickenson had Jupiter conjunct Neptune in Capricorn. And, of course, in Capricorn, Jupiter is in its detriment, or its, no, I think that's more of Jupiter in its fall. Yeah, it's not in its detriment. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, in its fall in Capricorn. And there's a certain thing about how Jupiter is supposed to be like about growth and expansiveness and all this. And then there's something about Neptune, which I feel kind of like muddles that. Oh, I mean, I'm not going to read too much of this, but I have this other book that I got called Madness, Rack, and Honey by Mary Ruefle. And you can look up her on YouTube. Maybe I'll put a link in the comments or my notes and references, because she does these. She's like you can watch her basically perform or do readings of the stuff in this. But I was often like, no, I have to admit that doing an astrologer, a lot of what is around this is sort of like, what does it mean to, like, if you have a chart that is your karma or your destiny or the person you're supposed to be in life, and like what do you have to do to fully realize your potential, to actualize yourself. And the thing is, like, Emily Dickenson has a reputation as being one of the great American poets, one of the great literary figures, but she's not somebody who really like self-actualized in the way that we tend to associate with that idea. And it starts off with this. This is not Mary Ruefle, but it's a quote by somebody else named Muriel Spark, and describing Emily Dickinson's life. She says, "From first to last, there is no evidence that she laid any plans for the course of her life. She seems above all to have wished to avoid doing something about her life, and when from time to time the obligation was put to her to make some sort of career for herself and so prepare for her future, she tried to meet these demands and failed." So it's like, I mean, it goes. Emily Dickenson was one of these people who described herself as being of barefoot rank. And she's somebody who basically stayed at home, living with her family, who never really got a career, who never really got a job, who never really actualized. And this is something I think maybe goes with the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn in her chart, which is admittedly a lot different from the Saturn, Mars, and Neptune dynamic in Pisces that we have right now. But there's something about this is interesting to me, because you've got this strong Neptune influence in the chart, And for her, Mars is actually in Aries conjunct Pluto, right? And Pluto is often, you know, maybe Pluto could be this sort of like stubborn, like fixed, not changing, but there's like more that Mars and Aries is like we have this association of being fiercely independent, right? And yet Emily Dickenson is Mars conjunct Pluto in Aries, and she lives with her family her whole life, right? And she doesn't do this thing that people associate with actuating, actualizing, individuating, and yet she becomes one of the most renowned literary figures in all of, you know, American literature, right? I'll just read another little bit of this. I mean, I was kind of hesitating because it feels like I'm kind of just like selecting little bits, but if you want to read the whole thing, you can find it online, being performed, being read by the author herself. But this is under Emily Dickinson's living conditions. This is what she says. Emily Dickinson never lived alone for a single day of her life. She lived in a house with her father and mother and sister. After her parents died, she lived with her sister Vinnie until her own death, after which Vinnie lived alone. When we call her a recluse, we mean that after a certain point in her life, she ceased to leave the house, though it is documented by herself that she would many times go out at night when there was no one else around. So, you know, in Emily Dickinson's world, that she has this reputation, people often bring her up as a very solitary figure, but she was always living with other people. She was always part of a family dynamic, and the only way that, like, in this, how it's described anyways, the only way that she's finding this sort of this really independent individual thing is just going out and walking in the night on her own. And that is maybe that could be part of the Pluto, being like the being able to be independent and walk through the darkness of the night on your own. But it's not, you know, that there's different ways that Mars and Aries can express its own independence and individuality rather than be just, finding a way to pay for a cramped little one-bedroom basement suite in a you know, like there's a different cultural historical context where, you know, and being a millennial where the housing market is completely screwed up, and it's like, really does it really make sense to put out all this energy to be like self-actualizing, is to like be stuck in like really shitty living circumstances while some landlord makes a whole bunch of money off you and also wets, like, sorry, I shouldn't say, like, some landlord is just like getting their panties in a twist because somebody is taking their Air BNB away from them. And meanwhile, they're making all this money off of you in the name of you being independent and self-actualizing. Versus, you can't be independent and live with your family. You can't be solitary and live with your family. I don't know. This is just some stuff that's on my mind in the context of what we're dealing with around these dynamics, right? Okay, I don't know. I'm just expressing, this is what's been coming up for me since I made the last video anyways. Hopefully, well, like it or not, I don't know, here it is. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel.